And my feeling, if we sort of say,
All right, Jenny, do you think we should go ahead and get started?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I'll go ahead and
I can continue to admit people and you can just go ahead.
all right. I'll share my screen. So everybody can hear me okay? All right, so welcome. Thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to be talking about the proposed amendments for the pre-rulemaking process for proposed changes to Vermont's use of public waters rules. I'd like to start out by introducing our Lakes and Ponds Program Manager, Jenny Austin, to kind of start the evening off.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and being engaged on this topic with us. Ever since moving to Vermont in October, I've been really just so impressed with the communities here and how educated and passionate and intelligent and just caring that everyone seems to be about each other and the environment, especially our lakes. So our lakes program would not function without the partnership and support from many of you, whether it's volunteering to greet and inspect boats, identify invasive plants, collect water quality data, coordinate outreach, or like work together on policy changes such as these use of public waters rules. So I really just wanted to take a moment and emphasize just how valuable your input has been throughout this prolonged rulemaking process, from the initial petition by the Responsible Wakes for Vermont Lakes to the adoption of the first round of rule revisions in April of 2024. Your public engagement has already resulted in some of the most protective wake sports regulations in the nation. So your additional petitions and public comments led us to consider even further protections. And that's what brings us here today. So this webinar is meant to be a way to introduce the rulemaking process and explain the revisions that DEC is proposing so far. We know that we weren't able to address all the issues raised in the petitions in our proposed changes. So we're eager to revisit any remaining concerns together as part of the pre-rulemaking process, which is kind of like a brainstorming session. So for this webinar, we're happy to answer questions about the process and the content we'll be sharing, but we won't necessarily be addressing public comments yet. We're gonna get into more of the weeds and everything July 30th and 31st. But you're welcome to submit written public comments anytime, and we plan, like I said, to discuss more and have verbal comments and everything July 30th and 31st. So in a moment, I'll be turning things back over to Laura DeLugalecki. She's recently transitioned into her official role as the Policy and Outreach Coordinator for our Lakes program. So even before this fancy title, she's taken on most of the rulemaking work in our program in addition to her permitting responsibilities, and she's done a phenomenal job. So she's going to take it from here, and I'll help monitor the chat.
Jenny, I think you're muted.
Did you guys get any of the
Oh, yeah, it
When-
was just like your last sentence.
Oh,
Um,
I'm sorry. It must have been an automatic muting something or other. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's okay. Okay.
just yeah, Laura's gonna take it from here, and I'll help to monitor the chat and answer questions. Sorry about
Okay,
that.
just a second. No, that's okay. Okay. I am going to. Sorry for the technical difficulties, folks. All right. Back on track. Thank you so much, Jenny. Okay. So as Jenny mentioned, my name's Laura DeLucalecki, and before we dive in, I just want to do a couple housekeeping items. So please remain muted while you're on this webinar. This keeps the feedback to the minimum, and it just helps everyone to be able to hear clearly. This webinar will be recorded, and I will post it to our rulemaking webpage. I'll have a link to that webpage at the end of this presentation. So here's a list of what I'd like to cover today. I anticipate that this will take about 45 minutes or so to go through this material. I'm planning to begin with the broad, big picture regarding the use of public waters, regulations, where we've been, where we are, where we're proposing to go. And I want to talk briefly about the petitions that were submitted over the last year, requesting to prohibit wake sports, and some of the issues with the existing wake sports rule, and then finally really explain and walk through all of our proposed changes. As Jenny said, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We've saved a little bit of time at the end to answer some questions, but this really isn't a time for public comments. We're hoping that the questions can be geared towards clarifications or about the process or something I said. I also just want to acknowledge that some of the content that I'm going to be going through assumes a lot of knowledge about how we've regulated wake sports. And I assume a lot of you on this webinar have been involved in the process, but if you're missing pieces to that puzzle, just put a question in the chat and we can catch you up. All right, so working with a state agency, we talk about a lot of different terms like rules and statutes and regulations, and there's a little bit of nuance. And I just wanted to start from a framework so we all understand that there are use of public waters statute, and there's also use of public waters rules, and they are two different things. Statutes are enacted by the legislature and can only be changed by the legislature. You can tell if something is a statute based on how it's referenced. This VSA here, that means Vermont Statutes Annotated. That means it's a statute. So the use of public waters statute was enacted, I believe, in 1969. And this statute provided the authority for the state to regulate uses on public waters. And this statute also provided authority for some sort of governmental entity to make rules regulating what type of uses could be allowed on public waters, specifically types of watercraft and other types of activities. So back in the 1970s, there was this group called the Water Resources Board, and they would review proposals from towns and lake associations that wanted to have a lake-specific rule. And the Water Resources Board would either initiate rulemaking or they would deny it, but they were in charge of reviewing these requests. And then in 1994, the Water Resources Board came together and adopted a comprehensive set of the use of public waters rules. And this is what we have today. It formalized some of the basic rules that apply statewide to recreational uses in lakes across the state. Issues about speed limits and what size lakes high-speed boating can occur. And then these rules also house all of the existing lake-specific rules before these rules were adopted in 1994 in the appendices of the use of public waters rules. So in 2012, under Act 138, the rulemaking authority of the Water Resources board and then panel was transferred to the Agency of Natural Resources. So now all of the rulemaking authority sits with the Agency of Natural Resources. These rules were designed to regulate uses on public waters, specifically to manage conflicts between uses, but the rules also include information about how petitions can be considered, how managing the aquatic invasive species infestations, specifically an allowance to prohibit uses temporarily to control the spread of an infestation. And as additional issues came up over time, new rules were adopted. So issues about seaplanes or personal watercraft, also known as jet skis, came up, and they were addressed through these set of rules. So the use of public waters rules really is a living document that can be responsive to issues and be updated over time. Updates aren't super fast, but they can be responsive. So when the Agency of Natural Resources is faced with making decisions about a new rule, our role as a state agency, as part of the executive branch, differs from how other entities like the legislature or the former Water Resources Board could review requests for rules. As a state agency, we are charged with managing and balancing multiple considerations. So not only are we looking at all the different environmental impacts, but we're also managing for public access. And when we make decisions as an agency, the decisions have to be based in objectivity, science, or technical information. And this is different than how the legislature can react. They can react based on public opinion, which is not necessarily something that is in our charge. We really need to focus on that technical information. For example, we know that a lot of the comments we received during this most recent petition process were in favor of banning wake sports, but we can't make our decisions based on public opinion. We have to have some sort of technical information to make our decision. The role of the legislature could be to pursue a ban based on public opinion, but that's really not something that the state agencies can do. Similarly, the Water Resources Board could base decisions on public opinion, but they were a different entity with different procedures. I've spent a good deal of time diving into the limited records we have about how past Water Resources Board decisions were made. And there was a good deal of inconsistency over time about similar issues on different lakes and coming up with different decisions. It seems that decisions were often made based on who were members of the board. And so with the agency, we're looking for some sort of more standardized process to making decisions. And as I mentioned, another consideration that we as the state have to take into account is public access. So a complete prohibition of a use is just not within our authority without some sort of proper justification and data to demonstrate that that is necessary. We're charged with regulating uses in the least restrictive manner. So a statewide ban is not the least restrictive approach, and a complete ban could restrict access in a way that's not legally defensible. So we understand that many of you have requested and advocated for a complete ban, but that's not something that's on the table or within our authority unless there's some sort of new data that would point us in that direction. Then the legislature would need to provide some sort of directive for that approach. So we'd really like to hear your thoughts on how we can best regulate wake sports using the least restrictive means. Are there additional criteria based on evidence that could result in more protective standards? Any kind of justifiable evidence to add more criteria? We really welcome that from the public. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, a new use of public waters rule regulating wake sports was adopted and went into effect in April 2024. And even though this was the first of its kind in the country and it was cause for celebration, there were many who felt the rules didn't go far enough. And after adoption of this new rule, there are currently 30 lakes that are eligible for wake sports. The lakes listed here on this slide have submitted petitions. Have submitted petitions to the agency proposing lake-specific rules to prohibit wake sports. These are all lakes that currently have wake sport zones, and we're seeking an exception to the new rule. So I wanted to start off in talking about these petitions by saying that we acknowledge that this petition process was originally suggested to the public as a way to explore prohibiting wake boats on lakes that would be an exception to the new rules. And this has been an evolving process and an educational process as we've been diving into these petitions. And I really want to say that the quality of work and effort that went into these petitions was fantastic. It was really great. A lot of thought and effort was put into these. And as we were reviewing these petitions and more petitions came in, and we were digging into the information and had public meetings and reviewed the comments, it became clear that there were issues that needed to be addressed. And many of the concerns laid out in the petitions weren't actually lake-specific concerns. They were actually issues across all lakes. And as we began to seek legal advice on how to handle these petitions and think about how we would make these decisions, it really became clear that a lake-by-lake decision process wasn't consistent with how the agency makes decisions. This could lead to inequities in how lakes are managed across the state, as we need to hold them to the same standards. For example, if a smaller lake that's currently eligible for wake sports submitted a petition to the state requesting a prohibition on wake sports, specifically because their wake sport zone is too small, and they provide some justification to that, and we read this petition and we agree with it and prohibit wake sports, we make an individual rule for that lake. But there could be similar lakes with similar conditions, similar size wake sports across the state, and they don't have the same prohibition just because they didn't submit a petition. So this doesn't really align with our statewide approach to how we manage this state-owned waters. So ultimately, I just want to say these highlighted ones are ones that were all reviewed together, and we have issued decisions for them. These 3 other petitions are still under review.
Laura, just real quick, we
Oh,
left
sure.
Lake Fairley off in
Did
error. Apparently, Tom Ward called it out
My
for us.
apologies. I'm so sorry. I should have caught that. Okay. Yes, thank you. So ultimately, those petitions were denied. And I just want to say this wasn't a foregone conclusion prior to them being submitted. It really shook out in this as we were reviewing them and realizing what the main concerns were, that we needed to address this at a statewide level. And that the denials weren't a rejection of additional regulations. There were all these common themes and issues that we knew we needed to address through rulemaking. And we got so much valuable information from these petitions that contributed to our proposed changes. So while we were working on these petition responses and petition review, we were at the same time in the background compiling proposed changes to the use of public waters rules. So it was, we meant to simultaneously roll out an announcement for pre-rulemaking at the same time as issuing these petition decisions. And we see this as an opportunity to improve the existing rules beyond just wake sports and to address issues for lakes across the state. So before we dive into some of the proposed changes, I'm going to give you a 1-slide crash course in rulemaking. The formal rulemaking process is governed by the Vermont Administrative Procedures Act. And this rulemaking under use of public waters rules can be initiated either from an external petition or internally from the agency. And so right now we're here in this informal pre-rulemaking phase where we are drafting up proposed rule language, and we are soliciting input from the public, and we'll have this webinar as kind of a kickoff of this phase, and we'll have public meetings and a public comment period, and We may meet with other groups and incorporate concerns until we get to the point where we feel like we have a solid proposed rule and we're ready to go into formal rulemaking. So formal rulemaking is really a series of 4 steps, which are called filings. The first step is called pre-filing with the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules, also known as ICAR. This is basically a committee of agency people from different agencies across the state. They review these proposed rules and make sure they don't conflict with any existing rules or statutes. And once they give their stamp of approval, you go to the second filing, the proposed filing, and you file with the Office of Secretary of State. And this is what begins the official public comment period. So we'll take formal written public comments that we have to respond to, we're required to respond to. We have public meetings, there might be revisions. This could be quite an iterative process of taking ideas, showing ideas, getting comments, making revisions. And then we go to, when we finally got a place where we are happy, where everybody, well, maybe not everybody, but where we feel really good about the rule, we get to the third filing, and it's called the final proposed rule, and we file it with the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, also known as LCAR. And this signals the end of the public comment period. It also simultaneously gets filed with the Secretary of State again. So then the Legislative Committee reviews it. They may have comments or suggestions. And then if they decide to adopt the rule is officially filed with the Secretary of State and LCAR. And then the rule would be effective at a minimum of 15 days after the date of adoption. So this is a lengthy process. It does take 6 to 8 months, but it does allow for all the proper amount of time for review and participation and input to make sure we have a robust rule and that we've considered as much as we can. So I'm going to just briefly talk about the existing wake sports rule and a couple issues. But the existing wake sports rule had a very long pre-rulemaking and rulemaking process to get where it is today. The rulemaking was initiated in response to a petition from Responsible Wakes for Vermont Lakes. We had 5 public meetings. I think we had 9 meetings with affected user groups, over 700 public comments. So it was a robust public involvement. And the rule went into effect last summer. And there was a lot of thought and input and compromise that was put in to get this objective, science-based definition of a wake sports zone that is protective of the resource. We wanted to ensure that it was protective of shoreline erosion and prevented lake bed disturbance, which are the goals of the agency to protect water quality. The new rule limited wake sports to 30 inland lakes in Vermont and included provisions that were intended to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species through a home lake sticker program and the requirement of proof of decontamination. Just prior to the adoption of the new rule, the DEC began to hear feedback that safety wasn't adequately addressed in the original rule language. And it's true that our main focus when developing this rule was on minimizing environmental impacts, and our main focus was not on safety. The standard safety offsets for all motorboats was kind of assumed to be the default to address safety, but we acknowledged then and now that this is something that we would need to revisit. And this rulemaking opportunity now is a great time to incorporate safety into the rule moving forward. And similarly, some issues were brought up in the original rulemaking and even more so in this petition process about the cumulative impacts of multiple boats and impacts to nesting loons. And these weren't explicitly addressed in the original rule. And this is a great opportunity to explore ways to improve the existing rule. Then, of course, when it came time to implement the rule, the biggest issues came from the home lake rule and proof of decontamination requirements that were written into those new rules. Based on the timing of the adoption of the new rule, we knew that having a sticker program up and running would be really difficult to pull off. But as we began planning for the future and looking into how we would implement this portion of the rule going forward, that's when the issues with the rule language became apparent, and it led us to the proposal to change these items. So right here on the screen now is the language of the existing home lake rules section. And I think that a lot of people in the public have thought that the home lake rule just meant that you could only stay in one lake, but really it allows you to have a sticker to stay in one lake, and then you have to decontaminate when you move in between lakes, as long as you meet the decontamination requirements. And this home lake rule rests on the idea that there is a robust decontamination available around the state. And it became clear during that first year of implementation that the decontamination infrastructure that was assumed to be available when this portion of the rule was written was not available. And without a robust decontamination infrastructure, the home lake rule is not workable. And on top of that, there's not a way to track wake boats across the state and boats coming in and out of Vermont. The Vermont Department of Motor Vehicles doesn't register whether a motorboat is a wake boat or not when people register their boats. And this is something that they are not willing to do. This is a huge challenge to administering a sticker program. And it wasn't fully understood prior to adding this requirement into the rule. And tracking wake boats that visit from Canada or neighboring states is also something that we don't have the infrastructure or the capacity to do. We did hear the requests from the public that as an interim solution, can't we just restrict wake boats to one lake per year? And that's really beyond our authority to implement. We don't have the authority to restrict access in that way. There are no existing rules that allow us to restrict access in that manner, and we don't have the authority to make some sort of declaration like that without formal rulemaking. So our working solution from the last year and for this boating season was that instead of the home lake rule as written, it's that we require that when wake boats travel between water bodies, they must be decontaminated following our guidelines. So although there wasn't a sticker, so it wasn't implemented exactly as written, due to the constraints I was just describing, it was implemented in a functionally equivalent manner to ensure that if a wake boat is traveling between two water bodies, that it has to be decontaminated. We also have existing transport laws and existing laws that require boaters to comply with breeders' inspections, and breeders interview boat operators to find out where they were prior to entering this water body. So that really serves as a similar purpose as a home lake sticker. And similar challenges were found with this proof of decontamination requirement written into the rule, because it required them to be done at state-approved decontamination sites. And these sites do not currently exist. In place of this requirement, we were requiring wake boats follow the decontamination requirements that we provided. And I want to say that, you know, we at the state have the same goal as the public. We want to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. And these two provisions were really well-meaning, but under our current conditions aren't really workable. And the sticker don't seem to provide any additional protection. We do have existing regulatory tools under the statute 1454, the transport statute, that we can more heavily rely on to manage decontamination. And also administering these two provisions specifically would be a gigantic administrative burden for less than 1% of the boats in the state. In 2024, 187 wake boats were recorded to be launched at public access areas, and 167 were launching at the same water body that they last visited, or essentially behaving like they were at a home lake. Only 20 boats visited a different lake than they last visited, and those boats were required to decontaminate before entering that water body. I just wanted to take a second to talk about the greeter program and how they're trained to interview a boater when they show up at an access area. And they ask them, where were you, which water body were you on last? And they have information about whether or not there are infestations at those water bodies, so they can assess the risk level. And this interview is really similar to what a home lake sticker would provide. The greeters can ensure that boats get a decontamination if required, or tell the operator they're not in compliance. And these are measures that we already have, and they work really similar as if someone were to have a home lake sticker and we're asked to get a decontamination under the same scenario. And of course, there's room for improvement. There are ways to make this system more robust, but it can be and is functionally equivalent to what was written into the use of public waters rules. And it seems like a better solution to focus our very limited resources and efforts here to improve this program, its efforts, and its messaging, to have this shared goal of decontamination across the state. So now I'm going to walk us through the proposed changes to the use of public waters rules. And please remember that none of these proposed changes are set in stone. This is a starting spot, and these are based on the public input that we've received during the petition process and feedback from the public. Based on our experience implementing these rules, we hope that they're designed to be protective of the resource and address issues where we know there were areas of concern, but also they're bound by our authority. We can't overreach our authority. We have to contemplate access and balance of uses across the state. So first, I'll go through the proposed changes that specifically have to do with wake sports. And then I'll briefly touch on some of the other issues that we're proposing to change in the use of public waters rules. So based on the valuable information that we got during the petition review process, it became clear that especially the lakes that are on the smaller end of the wake sports eligible lakes were experiencing use conflicts. Many people spoke about the exclusionary effect of one wake boat dominating a lake on smaller lakes and all other users exiting that lake as soon as a wake boat came out. And we heard concerns of multiple boats operating at the same time on smaller lakes, amplifying the impacts. So, this was a message we heard repeatedly and across many petitions. And we really looked into what type of metrics and objective information we could use to address these concerns. And we came up with a few things. And so our first proposal was that requirement that wake sport zones also be at least 3,000 feet in length, which we believe more appropriately aligns with a wake boat behavior. Wake boats typically travel in a mostly straight line for a run at about 10 to 12 miles per hour. And a 3,000-foot run allows for about a 3-minute straight run, which my understanding mimics a pretty typical behavior. And this is something that was contemplated in the original rulemaking, but it wasn't explicitly included in the first round of rulemaking. I'm not exactly sure why. And I kind of view this as a correction now moving forward. The other two elements we looked at were increasing the size of the wake sport zone, so requiring that they have at least 100 contiguous acres of lake that's at least 500 feet from all shore, 500 feet from shore on all sides, and 20 feet deep, as opposed to the current 50 contiguous acres. And then also an allowance for shape normalization to remove odd-shaped sections. I'll show you some visualizations of what that looks like in just a second. But first, I just want to show you what this would look like in terms of the 30 wake sports eligible lakes, how this would impact whether or not they can have wake sports under these proposed changes to the definition of a wake sport zone. So if the lake is highlighted, they submitted a petition. If it's orange, they would not be eligible for a wake sport zone. If it's blue, they would. So you can see there are some lakes who didn't apply for or submit a petition, but they would no longer be eligible under these proposed conditions. One thing I wanted to point out here, down at the bottom, we have Molly's Falls Reservoir. And just weeks after the original rule went into effect, Molly's Falls Reservoir surface water level is managed by a dam. And for one reason or another, they had to lower the water level permanently. And that water level impact made the wake sport zone less than 50 acres, removing Molly's Falls from eligibility for having a wake sport zone. So regardless if any of these proposed changes go through, we will continue going through rulemaking to remove Molly's Falls Reservoir from the list of eligible lakes for wake sports. So I'll talk about the shape normalization item first. So the idea, well, first of all, I want to say that these changes were based on some great recommendations that we received from the public. And the idea is that we would use standard GIS protocols. And if this were adopted, we would make those protocols available to the public. But the idea is that you would just kind of smooth out the shape of the wake sport zone, remove the dog legs, have a more uniform wake sport zone. You know, the varied shape of a natural shoreline causes some really strange shapes. And it's not really practical for boating. There's like little tiny offshoots that nobody's doing wake sports in. And it's also beneficial to the wake boater in two ways. It's more intuitive so that they know that they're in the wake sport zone. It helps improve compliance. And it also provides a little bit of a buffer for compliance reasons. And also, if there is a little bit of surface water fluctuation, the boater is definitely in the wake sport zone because it's a little bit of a buffer. So here's just an example of what some of that shape normalization may look like. Here's Echo Lake in Charleston, you know, just kind of remove some of the jagged pieces. And this also shows the other two considerations. Has to be at least 100 acres and 3,000 feet long. Here is Salem Lake in Derby, and you can see there's a whole bunch of weird stuff on the eastern side of the lake, and that's all smoothed out to make a more normal shape. Okay, and to get to this other change in the definition about why would we choose 100 acres? So this number shook out after looking at the 30 wake sport zones under the shape normalization and the 3,000 foot length requirement. And this 100 acres seemed to better accommodate multiple runs and multiple wake boats. And this seemed like a less restrictive approach to address the cumulative impacts of multiple uses. And I'll show you how we got to the determination that 100 acres would allow for multiple pathways and runs. So here's an example on Lake Fairley. This rectangle sitting over the wake sport zone. This is under the wake sport zone under the proposed conditions of 3,000 feet long and the shape normalization. So this rectangle represents a typical wake boat run. It's 3,000 feet long and 1,000 feet wide. So that's kind of showing 500 feet of impact on either side. And on lakes that were less than 100 acres, you could partially fit or barely fit one rectangle on a lake. So there's kind of only the opportunity for one wake boat run in this wake sports zone. If one wake boat is out there, it's kind of dominating the space and impacting other uses. And as we looked at all 30 lakes, 100 acres seemed to be the cutoff. The smallest lake that would still be wake sports eligible is Harvey's Lake. And you can see here, there's 3 different runs. They do overlap, but there are 3 different spaces. But as the lakes get larger, there's Crystal Lake, there's more and more of these rectangles. So there's less conflict of uses here. The next set of changes that have to do with wake sports are addressing safety concerns and loons. So we want to add language, we're proposing to add language that wake boats engaged in wake sports should be required to remain 500 feet from all other uses rather than the 200 feet that are already in existence. And this was in response to a lot of comments we got about safety and the fact that our offset from shore is 500 feet based on the data that shows that a wake boat's wake dissipates to be equal to a typical motorboat at 500 feet to equal the same wave energy as a typical motorboat at 200 feet from shore. So using that same logic, it would be the same wave impact. So just a greater offset for wake boats from other uses. And then we wanted to require that active nesting loon sites have additional protection. So we are proposing to remove the home lake provision within the wake sports rule based on a lot of the justification I talked about a few slides ago, the capacity of our agency, the efficacy of the sticker, removing the proof of decontamination requirement just because there is no infrastructure for this provision. And the standards aren't really clear as written and they're not enforceable. But we really want to preserve the intent of this section of the rule, which is the prevention of the spread of aquatic invasive species. And so we propose to add a new section to the use of public waters rules, specifically focused on decontamination. So the section 4 would be about inspection and decontamination requirements for all vessels. And so it would reference back to the transport statute 1454 to lay out the groundwork of inspection and decontamination protocols. And the point of this is to adopt rules around inspection and decontamination to formalize the process, more clearly outline requirements, strengthen them for both boaters and for greeters. We could include procedures, roles, responsibilities, and have a stronger reference for enforcement and dealing with violations. So although we're proposing to remove the home lake rule and the proof of decontamination, our intent is to strengthen inspection and decontamination requirements for all vessels. Another proposed change is how wake sports eligibility, so whether or not a lake can have wake sports, is listed and managed in the rules. So if you recall a few slides ago, I talked about the surface water level change at Molly's Falls and how it took it from being wake sports eligible to ineligible. Currently, if wake sports are prohibited, it's listed in Appendix A of the use of public waters rules as wake sports prohibited. If we want to change that, we have to go through formal rulemaking, which is 6 to 8 months. We can't just say, oh, no longer meets the criteria. We have to go through the rulemaking process. And so this doesn't allow us to be responsive in a timely manner. So we propose adding some language to keep an agency managed list that's updated annually based on the conditions at lakes as to whether or not they meet those criteria, those specific criteria, rather than keeping it in the appendices. And I've done some inquiring. I don't see any kind of downside in changing the way it's listed. I don't see it as more or less protective. It's just a different way of managing it. and allows us to be more responsive. But if you have concerns about this, you're open to hearing it. So here is the language that we're proposing at the moment. It says the secretary may update a defined wake sports zone or the eligibility of it on an annual basis, should some characteristic change, like surface water level, but really has to do with whether or not it meets the definition. So this wouldn't be like arbitrarily removing or adding lakes to the list. It would have to do about whether or not it met the definition. But then there are a couple other caveats in here. And that is if there is some specific lake management activity or scientific research happening on that water body where the presence of wake sports will negatively impact water quality. So then it could be added or removed to the list. And importantly, any change to the list would still have to go through a public outreach process. It couldn't be arbitrary. It wouldn't be done in the dark of night. It just doesn't have to go through formal rulemaking, but it would have to follow the public outreach process outlined in the use of public waters rules to proceed with the change. So those were the rules, the proposed changes that have to do with wake sports. In the upcoming weeks, we'll share a document showing the marked up changes and the wording that we propose so that you can see kind of the tracked changes of the language we're proposing and you can react to it and suggest things. It's not on our website yet, but it'll be up there soon. But we do have a summary document on the rulemaking webpage that goes through all the details of all the proposed changes, and a frequently asked questions document that addresses some of the reasons why we're making these changes. So some of the proposed changes are administrative in nature. There's blank appendices. There's a couple errors we've found, so we'd like to just tidy it up. We propose to add reference to Title 23, the regulation that deals with regulation of motorboats. Essentially has to do with speed limits and some safety issues. I think incorporating those into the rules will give us a better foundation for the rules that we propose going forward. In section 2, there's a section on the consideration of petitions. And as it's written now, it really only addresses rulemaking as it comes from the public or through the petition process. But I wanted to clarify that that any kind of proposed rulemaking has to go through the same standards from the agency as it does from the public, just to ensure that we aren't reviewing things differently. There was petition review information in section 2 and section 3. I propose to combine it. And then I think there are some relics from when this was the Water Resources Board, but they had a requirement that public meetings could only be held in the summer. And we have hybrid meetings now. We can have meetings whenever, any time of year. And the board also had a requirement that all rulemaking proceedings will be combined together and reviewed once in a year. And it's fine to do it that way, but I don't think that we should be required to do it that way. I think that we should be more responsive. Another section that exists in the use of public waters rules, specifically, it identifies the ability for municipal delegation, or basically for a municipality or a town to be delegated to administer the use of public waters rules. Currently, it doesn't really say much of anything, and so we wanted to add a lot of detail to this. We want to clarify the delegation could be granted fully, so for the entire set of these public waters rules, or partially for a specific use, and then identify a process for submitting a delegation request. So that'd be somewhat administrative, but what are the steps? How do you apply? What information do you need? And then a requirement to have a written agreement between the agency and the municipality about the scope. And then there's a requirement that's in statute, in the use of public waters statute, that says that the municipality has to adopt a bylaw and it has to be consistent with the use of public waters rules in order to manage the delegation. And so we want to cross-reference that. We want to make sure that we're clear about the burdens of enforcement and costs, and clarify that delegated municipalities are required to adhere to the use of public waters rules. They can't go rogue and make a lot of their own rules. So I am unaware of any towns taking on full delegation of the use of public waters rules. I've not ever seen an example, but I have seen several partial delegation examples. And these have all been for the management of mooring fields. We've had agreements with Newport on Memphremagog and in the towns of Shelburne and Colchester on Lake Champlain. And that's really the only precedent we have for this currently. We also propose to add a new section about temporary use restrictions. And this is specifically to address public safety issues. So over the last 2 years after catastrophic flooding, there were many lake communities that were severely impacted by the floods. And folks who maybe didn't know how bad the impacts were would come on to some of these lakes and create a wake, and were making damage to property worse and, causing a lot of concern. And our agency heard a lot of feedback from the public. Can't you restrict uses? Can't you tell them not to do that? And we don't have the authority. So this would grant authority for temporary, like perhaps 15 days or during the state of an emergency or something, to restrict, a wake or, prohibit boat travel over 5 miles per hour on specific water bodies experiencing an emergency like a flood or a hazardous spill or something of that nature. So those are the proposed changes. Here is the timeline. It is up on our rulemaking webpage. And I love a good timeline, and I also hate a good timeline because this is our goal, and I really hope to stick to it the best we can, but we can't predict the future. But right now, we're opening up this public comment period for pre-rulemaking. I really hope people participate, and that we'll have these public meetings at the end of July and be able to incorporate all that input. And then by early October, be able to submit to ICAR and begin the formal rulemaking process. And this would put us on track for rule adoption in early 2026, if things work out according to plan. And so, we're really hoping we can work together to make these rules as good as we can get them. And a recorded version of this webinar will be on our rulemaking website. I'll show this rulemaking website again in a second. There's also the announcements to join remotely or in person to public meetings. And you can submit written public comments to this email address. This is also on the rulemaking webpage. It'd be helpful if you could add the word wake sports to the subject line when you're submitting a public comment, because we get other emails sent to this email address. So we're having 2 hybrid public meetings. So you can either join in person or on Teams, and there's also a call-in option. Jenny, the Lakes and Ponds Program Manager, and I have been contemplating using these pre-rulemaking meetings to have a little bit of a different format. I mean, we've had quite a number of meetings where we've taken public comments about wake sports, and we're kind of looking for ideas on how to make this more engaging and collaborative and really get meaningful feedback on these proposed rules during this pre-rulemaking phase. Perhaps rather than having people come up and speak for 2-minute time slots, we could have working groups, more of like a workshop environment. Maybe some of you have suggestions. So stay tuned on this topic. We really want this to be a time to work together And the public meetings and hearings that we have during formal rulemaking will be that more normal format of, you know, getting to sign up for a time slot and give a comment. And no matter what, you can submit public comments. We're still kind of working out whether or not we can pull off a different format, because with a hybrid meeting, it leads to challenges about how workshopy you can be, but we're open to ideas and suggestions. Okay, so I really want to thank you all for tuning in the evening to listen to this webinar. I hope you have a better understanding of what we're proposing and where we've come from. And this is that rulemaking webpage. And I'm happy to answer any questions if we have time for questions.
And I apologize, I got a little bit backlogged with, I was trying to answer some questions in the chat, but there was a lot that were coming in at the same time, so I apologize. Yeah, does anybody have any questions you want to ask now?
I did ask, this is Gretchen. I did ask a question about some of the definition of, you know, making sure that there's space for a continuous run. Can you go back to help me understand who defined the necessity for that? That seems very subjective to the person who's actually using wake, you know, the wake sport. I don't understand why that's used as an objective necessity in the rulemaking.
Yeah, from my understanding that, well, you know, it was based on some interviews of wake sports operators and how long they typically operate in wake sports mode in a run. So it was based on information that we had gotten from the users.
But that seems very subjective, right? And what people need to enjoy the sport.
I'm not sure I follow, because I think that for a boat to operate in the way that it's meant to operate, that it would want that kind of, it would need that kind of space rather than doing shorter runs.
But again, that's very subjective because you can do shorter runs and it be very successful.
We're trying to create objectivity in our assessment for how a typical run usually is, you know, to be able to capture the practical use of these boats on our lakes. So, and trying to address the safety concerns. Sure, yes, a wake boat could operate and do short little 50-foot runs, but is that really what happens in reality?
50-foot runs?
Or whatever, very short runs. They could do a little short run and then turn around. But the practicality of that isn't likely. So we're trying to.
I mean, that's something that could be educated, right? I mean, that here is the zone, here is the space, this is the education necessary. I mean, it does feel like there's a complete lack of addressing the need for education with these rules. I feel like we're not even addressing, you know, licensing needs or, you know, any type of education for drivers with these rules.
I think that there is boater education that is required as part of registration. And there's a lot of stuff that's covered. I don't know though what all the details are that's covered. But that's a good point. There is a lot of education we could do.
Yeah, it feels like we're jumping a little bit to restrictions, and I know we're trying to avoid, you know, make it least restrictive, right? And education could go a long way before we make rules that are completely banning wake boats from certain lakes.
I hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I do suggest you put those comments in writing, because I think that's a very important perspective.
I will. I'll do that again.
Thank you.
Meg, I saw your hand up.
Sorry, I realize we're really supposed to be asking questions, so that's why I put my hand down again. But I just wanted to point out that we have been involved in this process for 4 years or more. So it's not like this has been a hasty process arriving at regulation versus education. I just wanted to make that point.
Good point. Thank you. Thank you, Meg. Someone's joining in. Does anybody else have any other questions? Chris?
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for all your work. I just, if you look at the revised list you're talking about, there's about 11 lakes in the Northeast Kingdom, which is about 50% of the lakes that are now in the final list. And 8 of those lakes are free of any invasive species. And they're that way because a lot of people have worked really, really hard to keep them that way. And it seems that the state is making rules, whether well-intentioned or not, that congregate the wake boats onto those lakes. And you're running from any providing any means of helping us protect those lakes when you know that the wake boats, that you recognize and state clearly that the risk of spreading invasive species by wake boats coming into those lakes is alarmingly high. So I was wondering if these lakes what your reaction would be to these lakes submitting a petition that we would be more than happy to have wake boats operate on our lakes, but we're not willing to have them operate on the lakes unless they've been properly decontaminated.
Well, Chris, I'll say.
It's not your problem. I don't care how it's done.
No, it is our problem. We're working on this problem together. And as I spoke with Stu, with Lake Caspian about this topic as well earlier. And yeah, I would encourage you both and for all the other AIS free lakes or Northeast Kingdom lakes, high water quality, pristine water quality, those, we didn't really address that topic in our statewide proposed revisions, the current ones that we have. So I would like to pursue additional criteria. What I explained to Stu is we need more like justification for singling out wake boats. We need more science and literature. If you guys can help us with that, that's an area a topic area that we're interested in looking at and in more detail. So, as part of this pre-rulemaking process, that's a perfect topic area to focus on.
Yeah, the only lakes that are free of invasive species that are on your list are all in the Northeast Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
All 8 of them. And I just don't think it's legitimate for you to say that, I'm happy to do the work or try to help support this, but I don't think it's legitimate for you to sit there and say you're part of the Department of Environmental Conservation and you're going to force all the lake boats, all the wake boats that we know. I mean, let me retract what I'm just saying. I think it's an established fact, all right, that's well known that wake boats are a source of spreading.
Just saying, I was going to make a comment, and then.
And if you're not accepting that, why do you need more evidence to support that? I mean,
well, we struggle. I'll tell you what we're struggling over, and it's the this distinction of wake boats versus all the other motorboats, and looking at the big picture and the fact that we only have 1% of the motorboats being wake boats. And yeah, like where is the higher risk? We don't want to ban all motorboats on all of our Northeast Kingdom lakes. But they are a very high risk source of aquatic invasive species. So that's where we really need to button up our justification for if we were to make that distinction. And yeah, I do agree if you were to take one wake boat and one stern drive or, regular motorboat and compare them, yes, the wake boat has more of a risk, but how much more of a risk? The literature is shaky, that's where we need your help to formulate that justification.
Well, between now and August is a pretty short time in order to get those things across.
If it hasn't been brought across to date. I mean, there are scientific papers. I mean, how do you think all the Great Lakes became infected with invasive species? How do you think zebra mussels became part of the U.S. problem? They were transported in ballast water. I mean, it's
That's what I'm not sure of, and I don't see
well,
evidence.
if you haven't figured it out yet, then there's no way you're going to be able to prove it. You have to accept scientific, if there is no truth, if you can't establish a truth about that subject in your own mind right now, you shouldn't be in the position you're in. That is a foregone conclusion. That is a known statement. That's a real fact. So you're denying facts if you don't recognize that that's a major problem. And it's also factual that if you have a inboard ballast tank, you're less likely to be able to inspect it than if you have a well. You can see what's in a well. You can't see what's inside a ballast system. Those are established facts.
They're saying they're not.
Sorry,
And I
what?
don't mean to be offensive to you. I'm sorry. I just it's
Oh,
not.
it's okay. No, I appreciate your feedback. I would encourage you to provide the scientific papers and, that show that wake boats are responsible for spreading invasive species everywhere. I think that it's a much broader issue than just wake boats. That's all I'm trying to say, I guess. It's yeah, it's a lot of the motorboats, and there's a lot
would
of
really-
water,
it would really-
residual water in a lot of the other types of boats.
It would really be helpful if people would identify themselves when they speak. Unless you have all of these windows up at once, you don't have a clue.
Right, and I think there's a couple people
Yeah.
might have had their mics on by accident. But Stu, you've had your hand up a while, so.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for bringing this up. And I think we dove into what Jenny and Laura they want to talk about process here, and we have the opportunity to write our comments. I have the same exact thing, and Jenny told you all that we've had this conversation about water quality and whether you're A1 capable. Becky, I'm on mute. So what I'm saying, we talked about A1 quality classification, pristine, that kind of thing. That's very subjective. But this, where Chris is going, is something that is very factual. And so my question was, between now and July, end of July, is there an opportunity to add some additional things with your office so that when we start talking in July, that maybe those will be on the list? Or is this list now what we're going to talk about, and we'll bring all this up forward in this next level of public hearing, and you say you're going to massage it before we go to the formal rulemaking? I just wanted more about process. Do we have an opportunity to affect what's going to be talked about in the end of July and add a few things like what Chris just said? If we could get some proof to you, could we get that added before the end of July and have you add that, so that then that's another item that would be discussed? Or will you wait till all your comments are collected and it's August before you decide, well, here's two more things that might be things that we could add?
Yeah, I think we're in a pretty fluid process phase, whatever, right now. So I
Yeah.
would say that it's very likely that what you see here today during the webinar is not what you'll see necessarily at the public meetings. We are adding our own additional section to clarify and add some decontamination, inspection and decontamination requirements into the rules. So they exist in statute in general terms, and we're trying to make it more clear and specific, and that the proper inspection and decontamination procedures. So yes, I would say there's other changes that we could make in advance of the end of July. Can't make any promises, but yeah, the end of July meetings as well are intended to be more like brainstorming and discussion, and trying to tweak the rules further.
Yeah,
So
as I said, this is a starting place. So we wanted to have something for the public to react to, and not, to kind of know where we were coming from and how we kind of are thinking to get to these places, but nothing is set in stone. And really, this decontamination and inspection section that Jenny is referring to, that I briefly touched on, could, really be used to address these, replace the home lake sticker and the proof of decon to have a more robust decontamination requirement statewide. So there's a lot of possibilities of language that could be put in there to make the program better, and tighten up those rules to address the spread prevention.
Charles. Charles Crampton, you have your hand up next. Oh, there you
Yeah.
are.
I guess one of my concerns is, we're on Willoughby and we have, kayaks, sit on top kayaks, regular kayaks, and, canoes, and, small grandchildren that were out in the lake. And, can there be anything in the rule that would provide the 500-foot distance from coming near any craft like that on the lake while we're out there?
Yeah, that's what we're proposing currently. 500-foot offset from all other users and people and docks.
Okay, so, and is there what's the enforcement mechanism for that?
Well, it's the same enforcement mechanism as all use of public waters rules, which is, this is a statewide issue. There are enforcement is under the purview of the State Police Marine Division, which is pretty small, and they have an agreement with the game wardens. And so, game wardens are out on certain lakes at certain times. They're not always there. However, if someone is violating rules, they can document it and alert a game warden, give them the proper documentation, and they can follow up. But this is an issue with all use of public waters rules across the state.
Laura, can you just clarify that? Are you saying that wake sports can't happen if there's a kayak that's within 500 feet while they're already in use? Or are you talking about stationary docks?
So the existing language requires, let me see.
A 6-year-old, like an 8-year-old is
Sorry, I'm just trying to find the existing safety language. I think it's stationary docks, but it's also I'm sorry, your question was about like any dock, however far it is out in the water.
I thought I just heard something that if there was someone out in another boat, that wake sports couldn't occur if there was a boat in the let's say they're in the wake sports area. You're just talking about docks. I
think for the
clarifying.
500-foot safety distance is from any other user.
Mhm.
So, yeah, if there's already, any other user, so a kayaker or a swimmer or another motorboat sitting in the wake sports zone, any wake sporter would need to stay 500 feet away.
And everybody would be responsible? Sorry, this is Emily. Everybody would be responsible for that? Because
It's
I've
the,
seen,
it's the
Only
boater,
wake sports
yeah.
boats.
oh, that doesn't seem very equitable.
Well, there's
s-
already a 200-foot safety distance for the other
Sure.
types of boats. Like that's a normal,
Yep,
like,
for
yeah,
anyone that's gone through the wake boat or
yeah.
excuse me, boating safety course. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
the
you're looking
reason why
to
we
enhance that.
increased that safety distance for wake boats is because of the wave attenuation and the same argument that was used for why we need to stay 500 feet away from shorelines to prevent shoreline erosion because of the waves. That's the same reasoning that we use to increase the safety distance to other users. So a swimmer who's on a paddleboard, we want the wave attenuation to have the same effect as the current regulation that's 200 feet for a normal motorboat. So
Right. So I guess my question is more preferential that if somebody decides to take a kayak at a wake sports, someone that's doing wake sports, that would then be the wake sports person would be in non-compliance.
I guess if a kayaker were
mean,
to be chasing a wake boat or something, and yeah, I guess that could happen.
I mean, I think the reality of how these are enforced, though, it would be more like a willingly, like getting way too close to other people repeatedly, not the scenario you're describing, but yes, that's what the language of the law says.
of the new law, the 500
well,
instead of keeping with US
proposed.
boating safety proposed. So, okay, so we'll talk with the legal counsel on that because I think making sure that we're with boating safety standards, and that's important. We can, we'll circle back on that.
Okay. Diane? It will take a couple more questions. We wanted to finish by 7:30.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I think that many of us that have been doing this work and been involved in the process for the last several years are struggling because we have a lot of people coming to us and we can't explain to them why it's okay for this class of boats that they're not able to be fully inspected and decontaminated when that's required by statute. We can't explain why it's okay for them to discharge water from ballast tanks into our lakes when that's forbidden by statute. And we can't explain to them why the DEC is so committed to allowing what you have publicly and under oath indicated is not a normal use to drive other normal uses off our lakes. And it would be really, really helpful if you could help us with that, because we don't have the information, for the people on our lakes.
That yes, we would be happy to share with you some information that you could relay to people. Definitely.
Thank
And
you.
some
I
of the
think that would,
information in this webinar, I think, does cover that in that, well, we didn't really get into this, but, just because something is a non-normal use, that doesn't mean that it needs to be prohibited.
I
And then-
understand that.
okay.
You indicated at the very beginning that statutes could only be changed by the legislature, and the statutes, the AIS statutes, as I have read them, I am a layperson, I am not an attorney. They're very clear. Boats must be inspected and decontaminated. By virtue of their design, these boats cannot be inspected. And because of the lack of facilities, they can't be decontaminated either. And I think the statutes are also very clear that you cannot discharge water into public waters. And yet we all know that these ballast tanks are emptied before these boats are taken back onto trailers. So I'm having trouble trying to sync up the statutes, which have to be changed by the legislature, with what in reality is happening on our lakes. And I fear for our lakes, particularly the 11 in the Northeast Kingdom, many of whom have the most pristine, cleanest water in the state.
Yeah, we can get into, I think, more of the details of the decontamination and inspection procedures. I will say that the statutes and the rules both say, to the greatest extent practicable, when it comes to like the drainage of the ballast tanks or the ability to fully decontaminate. So our requirements for decontaminating a wake boat definitely state to the greatest extent practicable. So yeah, it's acknowledging that not all water can be drained from these ballast tanks. In the same way, though, that a other watercraft, you can't fully drain all the water out of many of these watercraft.
Many of us have been working with your stakeholder team on this inspection and decontamination process. And a piece that perhaps is still missing is a plan to support lakes who have additional AIS deposited in them as we go forward, with support, financial and boots on the ground, as it were, to help us combat the effects of that. That would be a very important thing, perhaps, to include in our
Absolutely.
plans. We're all hurting trying to support the efforts to keep the AIS that are in our lakes already under control.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and definitely trying to work through those longer term alternatives and recommendations for leadership to hopefully, get some better funding, get some more attention focused on the management of invasive species and the prevention being the focus, because as you all know, these long-term management practices are so expensive, and it just is never ending once you have an introduction. And I agree with you too on focusing on an early introduction, trying to eradicate it, so that you not in that situation where you're having to manage something long term and after it gets established. So does anybody else have any other questions about the presentation tonight, or timeline, next steps? Okay, well, Laura, did you want to say anything?
No, I just really appreciate you all being here, and I'll try to get a recording of this up probably by tomorrow on the webpage. And please send comments. I put a link to the rulemaking webpage in the chat, and there's an email address, the email address there where you can send public comments. We really do want to hear from you. So thank you.
Yes, thank you all for everything. Somebody have something to say?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, David Bradshaw. I've swum Echo Lake and Willoughby Lake for more than half a century. Never ever had a boat come anywhere close to threatening me. 2022 on Willoughby, I came within a couple arms length of being run over by a wake boat. After it passed by, the operator looked and he was kind of astounded, but he did nothing to check on me and turned around and headed south on the lake at opening up the throttle.
No.
Didn't see me. I couldn't see him, but you know, this idea that somebody who's on in a kayak or certainly a swimmer, you can't get out of the way of a boat coming at you. I mean, just keep in mind that this is you know, the bigger the boat, the harder it is to control and stop. And I have no intention of stopping my swimming, but there are people in the family who get quite alarmed at the swims I take, and I'm going to keep at it. But just for the record, you know, that distance, there's a lot of enforcement that has to happen, and I've been to a lot of the meetings. Diane Leader certainly can attest to that, and others. And interesting tidbit is the weight promoters mention education and as though the people who've been normal use needs to be educated. But we're trying to keep these waters clean. I love swimming in beautiful water. And Echo and Seymour and Willoughby and Shadow Lake and some others there. And but Memphremagog, keep in mind, is 20 miles from Lake Willoughby, and there've been weight boats brought down, and we now have on good authority, scientific, that zebra mussels are known to be in Memphremagog. So there's, you know, the transportation thing, as Diane and others have said. I mean, without the enforcement, it seems like an immediate action drill needs to be made for environmental protection. And certainly, I'm not going to stand around while somebody laughs at my safety concerns. They're looking for real trouble. I mean, that's an outrage, but it's an equal outrage that people can nonchalantly put a boat in the water and have no idea themselves whether they may be releasing microscopic or larger alien elements into that water. So I just want to, I hope, you know, we've been at this for years. I hope you're able to take some quick action, increasing distances. I mean, by now you probably got the drift on where I'm at on these vessels, but definitely the situation is going to get more out of control. And the state has control of lakes and ponds and streams, and doesn't give it to the towns. So I would encourage you to take action very seriously. And I thank you for our opportunities to see you in person and see you on television.
Sure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much
Thanks.
for that. And feel free to supply us with written comments as well. That would be helpful. So, and likewise for anyone else, if you want to submit written comments, that's also very helpful. We'll try to follow up with anybody that had questions in the chat. So,
Right.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to stop the recording now. And like I said, I'll plan to have this up hopefully tomorrow on the webpage. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
thank you.
Thank you.